So in Screencast 3, we're going to spend just a few minutes thinking about the structure of the sport industry. We'll look at another model next week for understanding the sport industry, but here what I really want to do is look at the landscape, if you like. What are the major kinds of organisations in the sport industry? So I've called this a taxonomy of suppliers, and taxonomy is where it comes from kind of zoology or looking at species, where you classify different species and look at how they're related to each other. So I've tried to do that in looking at the sport industry and the range of organisations. So the first thing that it's worth saying is that the industry is really diverse, both in the nature of its output. So we go from facilities management, manufacture and distribution of sports goods, training equipment, organisations involved in the broadcast of sport, gambling organisations. We'll look at these in a while, but in some ways, when people talk to me about the sport industry, I say, well, actually, I don't think it is an industry that really gels together very well, apart from the fact that sport runs through it. But apart from that, the industry is really, really diverse. And it's diverse in three ways. So the type of products and services, and this includes professional sport, sports equipment and clothing and sportswear, facilities management, and many others, as we'll see on the next slide I'm going to show you. The type of provider. We've already said that we have three sectors in sport. The commercial sector, which is interested in return on profit. The public, not-for-profit government sector, which is interested in maximising social benefits and promoting certain kinds of behaviour. And then the voluntary self-help, sometimes called the third sector, which is also not-for-profit, which is largely about playing sport for sport's sake, which is a bit different than the public sector. The public sector is interested in sport because of the benefits, the non-sporting benefits, which sport brings: health, economic, social, behaviour, educational. In the voluntary sector, traditionally, the view has been that they're interested in sport is purely about sport, playing sport, getting better at sport, winning in sport. So we have different types of providers. And then we have a range of sporting activity and performance level. So we have a very wide range of sporting activity. And there's some debate about, what actually constitutes a sport. Is esports a sport? There could be some debate about that, but many people would include it in the sport industry. Other people wouldn't include it in the sport industry. And also you've got performance level. So you have, people beginning the sport, playing it recreationally, but at a low level of skill and commitment, but, very possibly high enjoyment, through to people playing at the very apex, at the very top of performance, the real elite athletes. So there's a huge range, and there are different systems, different structures, and the organisation of this can look quite different. So I'm going to show you this kind of slide, which we call the taxonomy of international sport. And myself and Mark Taylor put this together about 6 or 7 years ago. And you can see, just by talking about an example, how the sport industry changes here. Because if we were doing this today, we would probably have put somewhere on here esports, and esports isn't really on there at all, I don't think. So, it shows you how quickly things change and the landscape evolves. But the first thing you should see in this is that the scope is really quite wide. So usually on this course, we have some students who've come to us from a sport development and a coaching background. And I say to them that, well, really, you might be really comfortable and familiar up here if we talk about national governing bodies of sport or national sport associations, national sports organisations, national federations. So an example of a national governing body in England is the Football Association, which is the national governing body for football, or is the Amateur Athletics Association, or England Athletics, which is the national governing body for athletics in England. So we have national governing bodies linked to national governing bodies, and Darryl will explain more of this when he talks about global sport organisations. We also have, in this top corner here, we have international federations. So if the FA is the national governing body for football in England, FIFA is the international federation, right? And the regional federation in Europe is UEFA. So UEFA Champions League, UEFA European Championships at the international level. So we have international federations and regional federations which have a link to national governing bodies of sport. We also have a link through to these kind of multi-sport events. So the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, the Commonwealth Games, Federation, so CGF. If you're not from a kind of Commonwealth country, which used to be part of the British Empire, it used to be called the Empire Games before it was called the Commonwealth Games. The Commonwealth Games are a kind of, similar to the Asian Games or the Pan American Games. They are a kind of multi-sport games which happens on a 4-year cycle. And, they're not at the level of the Olympic Games, but they are the next tier down. Okay, so there is a relationship between some international federations and some multi-sport event organisations like the IOC, because, for example, any sport which is represented in the Olympics also has an international federation, which itself will have a regional federation, which itself will have a national governing body. Now, national governing bodies quite often have links into leagues, right? These can be professional teams or franchises, colleges, athletics, So, even in America, the NCAA controls kind of, the college sports scene in America, and professional leagues. So NGBs often have a close association with professional leagues. So the FA has got close associations with professional competition. The Rugby League has close associations with professional competitions in this country. Okay, so quite often a person involved in sport development will be very comfortable up here. They would also be comfortable down here when we start to talk about government departments, national government organisations, or NDPBs, non-departmental public bodies, or quangos. So in England, we have the national government. We have a government department, which is called Department for Culture, Media and Sport. It's not just Department for Culture, Media and Sport. There's also digital in there, but I always forget where the digital goes in the acronym. But it's Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, I think now. And the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport funds Sport England and UK Sport, who are two bodies who are involved in distributing government money and lottery money to national governing bodies and to sports organisations in the country. We'll talk more about that later in the module. So sport, if you come off a sport development organisation, you might be really comfortable with this. But then we also say, okay, well, the sport industry is bigger than this. What about manufacturing and retail? What about Nike, Adidas, Under Armour? 3 really big companies. So Nike is a 30 plus billion pound organisation a year. Yeah, its turnover is over 30 billion pounds, right? It's a Fortune 100 company, which means it's one of the top 100 companies in the world. So that's a big part of our industry. Now, if you've come from sport development or coaching, you won't have talked about this. And also, manufacturing is closely linked to retail, right? So a number of manufacturers actually have their own stalls. In this country, Nike don't have many stalls, but in its shops. But in many countries, Nike have done what's called forward integration. So we'll talk more about that in strategy. But they've moved down the supply chain from manufacturing into also owning their own retail outlets, taking a step closer to the customer. So we will, in this module, talk about manufacturing and retail. You know, Nike and Adidas are global sport corporations, and their sponsorship is a major part of this. Yeah. We'll also talk about things like gambling and gaming. This is a very big area of the industry. Yeah. In the UK, it's one of the biggest sectors in terms of value of the entire sport industry. Okay. Over here in facilities, we've got local authority facilities, but we've got gyms. And in the UK, the growth of gyms and budget gyms has been huge in the last 20 years or so. In a city like Sheffield, we've gone from having, maybe 2 or 3 private gym facilities to having over a dozen gym facilities. So that has grown, and that's been a big area of growth in the sport industry. Also as well, up here, another really important area is sport broadcasting, right? So we've got, organisations like Sky Sports, Setanta, ESPN in America, companies in China and companies in India, which broadcast and pay an awful lot of money for broadcasting rights. So we have these kinds of organisations involved as well. So non-sporting, but contributing and putting an awful lot of money into the sport industry. Yeah. We also have event specialist companies, so companies that specialise in events. That's probably a smaller sector as well. And looking at smaller sectors, we have sport analytics, but sport analytics is a growing area, which is increasingly important. So when you do your work-based learning project, a number of you may get the opportunity to work with a sports club using kind of sports analytics to help them make better decisions about player management, about player kind of transfer values and things like that. So that's an increasingly important area. Sports-related research consultancy is another related area, not very big in terms of value, but a number of our students go on to organisations like Nielsen Sport. So we've got 2 or 3 graduates from recent years who work for Nielsen Sport, which is a research company which provides bespoke and published that organisations can buy research on the sport industry. And then over here we've got kind of sport agents and other things which are also important. So what you can see, and I'm going to leave this kind of screencast here, is that there's a wide variety of organisations. Some loom larger in the landscape in terms of their impact, but if we take any one of them away, it affects the balance and changes things. But one of the things that you've got to do for your assignment in this module is to choose a organisation in the sport industry which is economically significant, i.e. it's big, its turnover is big, it has a major role to play, and assess the usefulness of economic theory for understanding its operations. So be aware of this landscape, be aware of the kinds of organisations, and ask yourself, what kind of organisation am I interested in specialising in through the assignment for this module? But we will talk more about this landscape as we go on. And in next week's lecture, we'll look at a different model for sport, simpler in some ways, but which looks at the flow of money around some of these organisations in the sport industry. So that's the end of the screencast. It's the end of the screencast for this week. The next lecture that you have, or information which has got PowerPoint slides, will be in the live lecture this week, when we'll be looking at things like the value of the sport industry. We've looked at what makes up the sport industry, but now in the next section, we're going to look at what's the overall value of the sport industry. We're going to use the UK as an example, but draw some international parallels, although the availability of data is fairly limited. And looking at some of these areas of the sport industry, we're going to say, well, who are the major contributors in terms of money? Which are the most valuable parts of the sport economy, and in which areas are the jobs and employment most significant? Okay, so that's the end of this screencast, and I will see you next in the live face-to-face sessions next Tuesday.